The emergency call came through just after midnight. A man's voice, unnervingly steady, reported that his wife had fallen down the stairs and stopped breathing. When paramedics rushed to the scene in the quiet Irish coastal town of Balbriggan, they expected a tragic accident. What they found instead would haunt them for years to come. At the bottom of the staircase lay 27-year-old Mary Goff, motionless beneath a duvet. Her husband stood nearby, claiming he'd tried to save her. But within moments of arriving, the paramedics sensed something deeply wrong. Mary's skin was cold, far too cold for someone who had just fallen. The injuries on her body told a story that didn't match a tumble downstairs. And her husband's demeanor. It was disturbingly calm, almost rehearsed, as if he were reading lines from a script he'd practiced. What investigators would eventually uncover wasn't just a murder. It was a meticulously planned execution that had been months, perhaps years, in the making. Behind the facade of a seemingly perfect marriage lurked a darkness that no one, not even Mary's closest family members, could have imagined. This is the story of how one woman's trust became her undoing, and how a man's cold calculation nearly got away with the perfect crime. Mary Goff was born on December 22nd, 1973, into a large, loving family in Balbriggan. She was the only daughter among 6 children, the cherished girl in a household of 5 brothers. Her parents, Marie and James Goff, weren't wealthy, but they provided something more valuable than money. They gave their children a home filled with warmth, stability, and unconditional love. Mary grew up especially close to her father. She was his little girl, his pride and joy. Friends and family remember her as naturally friendly, the kind of person who could light up a room without trying. She was reliable, easygoing, and genuinely liked by everyone who crossed her path. School, however, never really captured her interest. Mary was intelligent, but she found most academic subjects impractical and boring. She did what she needed to do, but her heart was never in it. Then, in 1989, tragedy struck. Mary's beloved father died suddenly. She was only 15 years old. The loss shattered the family, draping their home in grief that seemed impossible to escape. But even in the midst of her own devastation, Mary showed a strength that surprised everyone. While her mother and brothers struggled to find their footing, Mary became their rock. She held them together when everything felt like it was falling apart. She understood, even at 15, that her father's death had left more than an emotional void. There was a financial strain that couldn't be ignored. So Mary found a weekend job to help her mother make ends meet. After finishing school in 1991, she didn't pursue further education. Instead, she went straight to work as a bartender, putting aside any dreams she might have had for herself. Her focus was simple and selfless: keep the family afloat. For years, life settled into a predictable rhythm of work, home, and occasional nights out with friends. Everything changed in 1993 when a regular customer at her bar caught her attention. His name was Colin Whelan. He was 2 years older than Mary, recovering from a leg injury that kept him lingering at the bar longer than most patrons. Their conversations started casually enough, just friendly exchanges between a bartender and her customer. But there was something about Colin that intrigued Mary from the very beginning. He was charismatic and quick-witted, the kind of person who seemed to command attention effortlessly wherever he went. Colin came from a background similar to Mary's, a large working-class family from a nearby town. But unlike Mary, he'd pursued higher education, studying technology and landing a solid job as a computer analyst. He was organized, ambitious, and thoughtful, someone who seemed to have his entire future mapped out. To Mary, he appeared to have everything figured out. At first, Colin didn't seem romantically interested. He treated Mary like a friend, someone he could talk to and confide in. She became part of his social circle, attending parties with him and meeting his friends. Months passed this way, with Mary quietly hoping for something more but never pushing. Then finally Colin asked her out. One date became two became many, and slowly, carefully, a romance blossomed. Soon they were introducing each other to their families. Mary's mother adored Colin immediately. He was polite, respectful, and clearly devoted to Mary. Her brothers welcomed him like one of their own. Colin's parents, in turn, appreciated Mary's genuine warmth and down-to-earth nature. To everyone watching, they seemed like the perfect couple. Colin had stability, a car, savings, and a promising career. Marriage felt inevitable, just a matter of time. Mary allowed herself to dream about the proposal she was sure would come, imagining a future filled with love and security. But then, nearly 2 years into their relationship, Colin ended things without warning. There was no explanation, no argument, no clear reason, just a sudden, cold decision that left Mary completely blindsided. She begged for answers, even if only silently, but Colin gave her nothing. His silence was somehow worse than any excuse could have been. Mary spiraled into depression, barely leaving her home, questioning everything about herself. She obsessed over the night before the breakup, when she'd gone out with friends and Colin had tried to reach her. Was that it? Had she done something wrong by not being available? Was she being punished for having a life outside of him? Even Mary's mother couldn't make sense of it. She called Colin herself, hoping to understand what had happened. But he was distant, almost hostile, offering no real explanation. All he said was that it wasn't his fault Mary was like that. Whatever that meant, he never clarified. Mary had no choice but to try to move on, as painful as it was. Slowly, painfully, Mary began to rebuild her life. She threw herself into work and discovered talents she hadn't fully recognized before. She landed a job working on the film set of Rob Roy, and her natural organizational skills immediately stood out. People noticed how efficient she was, how focused and pleasant to work with. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. The production team was so impressed that they offered her another position on an upcoming project in Scotland. It was exactly the kind of opportunity that could have launched a real career for her, but Mary turned it down. Despite the clear sign of professional growth, despite the chance to start fresh somewhere new, she chose to stay close to home. Maybe it was loyalty to her family. Maybe it was the comfort of familiar surroundings. Or maybe somewhere deep in her heart, she hadn't completely let go of Colin. And as it turned out, fate wasn't finished with them yet. 6 months after their devastating breakup, Mary and Colin crossed paths again. There were no grand gestures or dramatic reconciliations, but the connection between them was undeniable. That pull, that inexplicable draw they'd felt from the beginning was still there. They both felt it. This time, though, things would be different. They approached the relationship with what seemed like renewed maturity and clarity. If they were going to try again, it had to be serious. From the very beginning of their reconciliation, they talked openly about the future, not as some vague possibility, but as a concrete plan. Mary found new stability in other areas of her life as well. She took a position as a secretary at a law firm, where once again her precision and efficiency impressed everyone around her. It was the kind of role that suited her perfectly, allowing her to use her organizational strengths in a professional environment. Colin's career was also progressing steadily, and in 1997, he purchased a house from his grandfather. The couple moved in together, finally settling into the life they'd once imagined for themselves. From the outside, everything looked promising. They had careers, a home together, and a relationship that seemed stronger than before. The natural next step was marriage, and Mary waited with quiet anticipation for Colin to propose. But before that milestone could arrive, something happened that would cast a dark shadow over their future. In 1998, Colin made a decision that would reveal something deeply troubling about his character. He got behind the wheel while under the influence and crashed into a neighbor's car. Inside that vehicle was an elderly couple. The 61-year-old woman in the passenger seat was killed instantly. Her husband survived, as did Colin. Both men walked away physically unharmed, but the consequences of that night could never be undone. What happened next was surprising and disturbing. Colin wasn't charged with driving under the influence, despite initial investigations pointing in that direction. The final verdict was a conviction for careless driving. He paid a fine and walked away a free man. Throughout the entire ordeal, Mary stood by him. She insisted to anyone who would listen that Colin was a good man, that the accident didn't define who he really was. But there were troubling signs that should have alarmed her, signs that revealed something cold at Colin's core. He showed virtually no remorse for what had happened. Instead of taking responsibility for the woman's death, he blamed the wet road conditions. He deflected, minimized, and avoided any personal accountability for ending someone's life. To some people who knew them, that denial was deeply unsettling. It suggested a man who couldn't or wouldn't face the consequences of his own actions. Later that same year, while the couple was on vacation in the Canary Islands, Colin finally proposed. The moment, like so much of Colin's life, seemed thoroughly calculated and premeditated. The ring, the setting, the timing, it was all carefully planned. When they began organizing the wedding, that same level of meticulous control continued. Every single detail was arranged with precision. On September 9th, 2000, Mary and Colin were married in what should have been a beautiful, joyful ceremony. The decorations were flawless, the event perfectly structured. But not everyone saw happiness on Mary's face that day. Despite the picture-perfect setting, a quiet sadness seemed to follow her down the aisle. Then, during the exchange of vows, something shocking happened. In front of all their friends and family, Mary suddenly broke down in tears. Without any warning, she rushed away from the altar and ran to the car outside. The room fell into stunned silence. Her bridesmaids hurried after her, trying to comfort her and calm her down. Some guests assumed it was simply overwhelming emotion, possibly triggered by the absence of her father, whose death years earlier had left such a profound mark on her life. Others weren't so sure. There was something about Mary's breakdown that felt different, more desperate than simple wedding day nerves. But Mary never explained what had caused her outburst. And after some time spent composing herself, the ceremony continued as planned. Following the wedding, Mary and Colin departed for an extended honeymoon across Asia, a trip Colin had planned with his characteristic attention to detail. But when they returned home, the people closest to Mary immediately noticed something had changed. She was more withdrawn than before, quieter, almost subdued. She began dressing in a conservative, modest style that seemed completely out of character. The stylish, confident woman, who had always expressed herself through bold fashion choices, now seemed to be disappearing into herself, shrinking away from the world. She stopped spending time with friends and rarely went out unless Colin was with her. It was as if her entire life had narrowed, revolving completely around her husband and his preferences. Her mother picked up on the change immediately and found it deeply troubling. Mary looked sad, burdened by something she either wouldn't or couldn't put into words. And Colin had changed too. The man who once treated Mary's mother with warmth and respect now spoke to her coldly, like she was an inconvenience. The shift was stark and undeniable. Something had happened between Mary and Colin. Her mother was certain of it. Perhaps during the honeymoon, perhaps even before, but Mary never shared the truth with anyone. Weeks passed, then months, but Mary's quiet distress never lifted. Those who loved her could only watch helplessly as she seemed to fade further and further away. Just 6 months after the wedding, on March 1st, 2001, at exactly 12:16 in the morning, emergency services received a call from the Whelan home. The voice on the other end belonged to Colin. His tone was eerily calm as he informed the dispatcher that his wife had fallen down the stairs and wasn't breathing. The dispatcher immediately instructed him to perform CPR while an ambulance was dispatched. Colin claimed he was doing exactly that. When paramedics arrived at the scene, what they found troubled them from the very first moment. Mary was lying at the bottom of the staircase, but something about the entire scene felt staged, artificial. A duvet had been placed over her body, which Colin quickly explained was his attempt to keep her warm. But her position was far too neat, too arranged for someone who had just suffered a violent fall downstairs. Her arms were straight by her sides, her legs together, her body positioned almost ceremonially. It looked less like the chaotic aftermath of an accident, and more like someone had carefully placed her there. The position alone made proper CPR nearly impossible to perform, which raised immediate doubts about whether Colin had actually attempted to resuscitate his wife at all. And then there was the temperature of her body. Mary was unusually cold, far colder than she should have been if she'd only just fallen moments before the call. The paramedics exchanged glances, their suspicions growing with each passing second. Colin stood nearby, watching the paramedics work, repeating the same question over and over again. "Is she alive? Is she alive?" But his tone was completely emotionless, robotic, devoid of any panic or fear. One of the paramedics would later describe the experience as deeply unsettling, explaining that Colin's behavior felt completely wrong for a man who had supposedly just discovered his wife lifeless at the bottom of their stairs. Despite every effort from the medical team, they could not revive Mary. She was rushed to the hospital, but it was already too late. At just 27 years old, Mary Guff was officially declared dead. Colin arrived at the hospital shortly after, having followed the ambulance in his own car. He was asked to identify her body, a moment that typically breaks even the strongest person. But witnesses noted that Colin didn't flinch. He showed no visible signs of grief, no tears, no trembling, no sorrow whatsoever. It was as if he were looking at a complete stranger, rather than the woman he'd married less than a year earlier. The hospital staff, accustomed to seeing families devastated by sudden loss, immediately sensed that something was very wrong with this situation. And then one of the nurses noticed something that would change everything. While Colin was signing documents, she spotted fresh wounds on his torso. They were scratches, deep red and unmistakably defensive in nature, the kind of marks that come from someone fighting for their life. The moment Colin realized the nurse had seen them, he quickly attempted to cover them up, pulling his shirt down and shifting his position. This discovery was immediately reported to the police. Questions began piling up, each one more damning than the last. If Mary had simply fallen down the stairs, why were there defensive wounds on Colin's body? Why was Mary already so cold when paramedics arrived? Why had Colin acted so strangely from the very beginning, showing no emotion, no panic, no genuine distress? Police investigators were brought in immediately, and Colin was asked to provide a statement about what had happened. He told them that February 28th had been just another ordinary day in their marriage. He and Mary had both gone to work as usual, then attended a homeopathy appointment together in the afternoon. Mary had recently enrolled in a course on healthy living, something Colin mentioned as if it proved how normal everything had been. Afterward, they'd returned home and spent the evening together. He claimed just like any other night. According to Colin's version of events, just after midnight on March 1st, he'd been downstairs watching television when he suddenly heard a loud crash from the staircase. He said he rushed to investigate and found Mary at the bottom of the stairs, completely unresponsive. He noticed that her sleeve was torn, which he claimed must have happened during the fall. He said he immediately called for help and tried to perform CPR while waiting for the ambulance to arrive, but his story was already beginning to crumble under the weight of the evidence. During questioning, detectives confronted Colin directly about the deep scratches on his torso. He was visibly caught off guard, clearly not expecting anyone to have noticed them or to ask about them so directly. When pressed for an explanation, he became flustered, stumbling over his words, offering no plausible reason for how he'd received such obvious defensive wounds. At one point, seemingly in an attempt to deflect suspicion, Colin actually removed his shirt to show the injuries to the investigators. They were stunned by what they saw. The scratches were far more severe than they'd initially imagined, clearly the result of someone desperately trying to defend themselves. When investigators pressed him even harder for an explanation, Colin flailed for answers. He denied being in any kind of struggle with Mary, denied any argument or physical altercation whatsoever. Then, in what seemed almost laughable to the experienced detectives, Colin suggested that perhaps the scratches had come from Mary's blood during his attempts at CPR. To demonstrate this absurd theory, he actually tried to wipe the wounds in front of the officers, as if that would somehow prove his innocence. The gesture only made him look more guilty, more desperate, more clearly lying. Realizing that Colin was stumbling badly and potentially about to say something incriminating, the investigators eased off the interrogation for the moment. But the damage was done. They were now firmly convinced that Colin Whelan was lying about what had happened to his wife, and that Mary's death had been no accident. Mary's family had also begun to see through Colin's facade. His emotional coldness at the hospital had been disturbing enough, but his behavior in the days following Mary's death was even more telling. Rather than making arrangements for his wife's funeral himself, he simply handed the entire responsibility over to her grieving relatives, as if it were an inconvenience he couldn't be bothered with. At the funeral service, he played the part of the heartbroken husband, going through the motions expected of him. But those who had truly known and loved Mary could see right through the performance. There was something hollow about his grief, something fundamentally false. Soon after the funeral, Colin was called back to the police station for a second statement. This time, his version of events had evolved in a telling way. He now claimed that when he'd approached Mary at the bottom of the stairs, she had actually reached up for him and scratched him in the process. It was his new explanation for the defensive wounds on his body. He also added a detail he hadn't mentioned before, claiming that Mary had just stepped out of the shower before the alleged fall. But this new piece of information directly contradicted what the medical examiner had found. Mary's body showed absolutely no signs of recent bathing, no dampness in her hair, no moisture on her skin, nothing. Investigators were now absolutely certain that Colin had killed his wife. The only question that remained was why. What could possibly have motivated a man to murder the woman he'd supposedly loved? Then the autopsy results came back, and they completely shattered what little remained of Colin's story. The pathologist's findings were damning and conclusive. There were no injuries whatsoever, consistent with a fall downstairs. No broken bones, no spinal trauma, no skull fractures, nothing that would support Colin's narrative of a fatal staircase accident. Even more critically, the pathologist determined that Mary had died much earlier than Colin had claimed. Her body temperature at the time of the emergency call proved she'd been dead for hours, not minutes. The timeline Colin had presented was physically impossible, but the most chilling discovery was the cause of death itself. There were clear, unmistakable signs of asphyxiation. Bruising around Mary's neck indicated she had been suffocated, though not with hands. The pattern suggested a soft object had been used, something that would leave minimal marks but still accomplish the horrible task. It was a deliberate choice, the mark of someone who had thought carefully about how to kill, while leaving as little evidence as possible. During their search of the home, investigators discovered a stretched bathrobe belt. It belonged to Colin. The forensic team believed this was the weapon that had been used to strangle Mary. She had been alone with her husband in that house. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of any third party. No one else could possibly have done this. The pressure on Colin was mounting, but he'd been careful. His home had been meticulously scrubbed clean of evidence, almost too clean. But investigators knew that in the modern world, people leave digital footprints that are much harder to erase. They turned their attention to Colin's workplace computer, and what they found there would expose the full horrifying scope of his planning. Colin, ever the meticulous planner, had deleted his browser history, thinking that would be enough to cover his tracks. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have anticipated, was that his company routinely backed up all employee computers as part of their standard IT protocols. Specialists were able to recover months and months' worth of search data. What they uncovered was absolutely chilling in its cold calculation. For at least 7 months, beginning long before he and Mary were even married, Colin had been researching how to kill his wife. He'd studied dozens of homicide cases, reading about methods, techniques, and most importantly, how killers had been caught. One case in particular seemed to have captured his attention and provided him with a blueprint. It was the case of Henry Louis Wallace, a serial killer who had strangled multiple women. Wallace had developed a specific technique to avoid detection. After killing his victims, he would cover their bodies with warm materials like blankets or duvets to delay the natural cooling process. This would throw off investigators' ability to accurately determine the time of death, potentially giving him an alibi for the crucial window when the murder had actually occurred. Colin had copied the method almost exactly. He'd suffocated Mary with the bathrobe belt, covered her body with a duvet to artificially maintain her temperature, and then carefully timed his emergency call to mislead first responders about when she'd actually died. It was calculated, practiced, and utterly heartless. But why? What could possibly motivate such elaborate planning? The answer, investigators discovered, was devastatingly simple: money and lust. Mary had a life insurance policy worth £200,000, a substantial sum, but that wasn't enough for Colin. Just before her death, he had doubled the policy to £400,000. There was one critical detail about the policy that made timing everything. The payout was only valid within the first 10 years of their marriage. Colin had done the math. Time was ticking, and Mary was worth far more to him dead than alive. But financial gain wasn't his only motive. Colin's recovered internet history revealed frequent visits to dating websites, many of them for open relationships and partner swapping. He'd been corresponding regularly with multiple women while married to Mary. One woman in particular stood out in the recovered messages. Her name was Helen, and she lived in England. Colin had been lying to Helen for months, telling her he was a widower whose wife had died tragically in a car crash. He told her this while Mary was still alive, still sleeping beside him every night, still believing in their marriage. Colin had told Helen he was planning to move to England to start fresh. He'd even been looking at rental properties, planning out his new life in detail. With the insurance money, he would have had more than enough to make that move to reinvent himself completely. Mary wasn't his wife anymore, not in his mind. She was simply an obstacle standing between him and the life he wanted. An obstacle he'd decided to remove. Despite the mountain of evidence piling up against him, Colin still hadn't been arrested. He likely believed he was too smart, too careful, that he'd covered his tracks well enough to get away with it. But that illusion came crashing down on April 10th, 2001, when he was formally arrested and charged with his wife's murder. During the interrogation that followed, Colin denied everything with the same calm demeanor he'd shown the night Mary died. The internet searches? Just curiosity, he claimed, nothing more than idle research. The conversations with Helen and the other women? Just harmless fun, he insisted. Nothing serious. But absolutely no one believed him anymore. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, damning. Colin was released on bail the following day, but under extremely strict conditions. He had to surrender his passport, report to police regularly, and remain within the country at all times. For months he complied with these conditions while awaiting trial. But his behavior during this period began to shift in a troubling way. He told his family members he was deeply depressed, that he missed Mary terribly, that he felt he had no purpose left in life without her. To some it seemed like genuine remorse finally surfacing. To investigators, it felt like the beginning of something else entirely. In March 2003, nearly 2 years after Mary's murder, Colin Whelan vanished without a trace. He had driven to Howth, a scenic peninsula on the outskirts of Dublin known for its dramatic cliffs overlooking the Irish Sea. It's the kind of place where people go to think, to find peace, or in darker moments, to contemplate ending their own lives. Colin's car was discovered abandoned near the cliff edge. All of his personal belongings were still inside the vehicle, untouched. His wallet, his identification, even a note suggesting he could no longer live with himself. To many people, including some members of his own family, it appeared to be a suicide. A man overwhelmed by guilt, they thought, who had finally chosen to end his suffering by throwing himself into the cold waters below. But the investigators working Mary's case weren't convinced, not for a single moment. They knew Colin in ways his family didn't. They'd studied his meticulous planning, his calculating nature, his absolute lack of genuine remorse. Colin didn't strike them as the type of man who would end his own life. The timing felt far too convenient, coming just as the legal walls were closing in around him. They suspected this was simply another layer of Colin's elaborate deception. One final calculated move in a game he still believed he could win. And as it turned out, their instincts were absolutely correct. For more than a year, Colin Whelan remained a ghost. Authorities searched for him, but he'd seemingly vanished into thin air. Then in the summer of 2004, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Colin Whelan was recognized by an Irish tourist in Majorca, Spain, working behind the bar at a beachside establishment. He hadn't thrown himself off those cliffs at all. He'd faked his entire death, staged the whole scene to look like suicide, and fled the country to start a new life under a false identity. The method he'd used to disappear was as calculated as everything else he'd done. He'd assumed the identity of a former neighbor, somehow managing to obtain that person's birth certificate. Despite having his passport confiscated as a condition of his bail, Colin had successfully applied for a new one by simply claiming the old one had been lost. The bureaucratic system, not designed to catch someone this determined to deceive, had given him exactly what he needed to escape. In a twist that seemed almost too perfect, too cosmically appropriate, the bar where Colin was working was called Karma. Even in his carefully constructed new life, he couldn't escape the irony. And true to form, Colin wasn't living alone. He'd moved in with a new woman in Spain, spinning her the same kinds of lies he'd told Helen back in England. He was unfaithful, manipulative and calculating, repeating the exact same patterns that had defined his relationship with Mary. Some people, it seems, never change. They simply find new victims. Colin's time on the run came to an abrupt end in July 2004 when Spanish authorities working with Irish law enforcement finally arrested him. He was extradited back to Ireland to face justice for what he'd done. The evidence against him was overwhelming and undeniable. The autopsy results, the internet search history, the insurance policy, the fake identity, the staged suicide, every piece fit together into an inescapable picture of premeditated murder. Then, in April 2005, Colin shocked everyone one final time. Rather than maintain his innocence and force a lengthy trial, he abruptly changed his plea to guilty. There would be no courtroom drama, no testimony from Mary's grieving family, no lengthy battle over evidence that everyone already knew was damning. Perhaps he realized the futility of continuing to lie. Perhaps his lawyers made it clear that conviction was inevitable, and a guilty plea might offer some minimal consideration. Or perhaps, in some small corner of his calculating mind, even Colin recognized that the game was finally over. He was sentenced to life in prison, the only outcome that could possibly fit the magnitude of what he'd done. Today, Colin Whelan is serving his sentence at Wheatfield Prison in Dublin. According to reports, he works in the prison kitchen and is considered a model inmate by the staff. He follows rules, causes no trouble, goes through the motions of being a reformed man. But good behavior behind bars cannot and will not ever erase what he did to Mary Gough. No amount of time served, no display of compliance with prison regulations, can bring back the young woman whose only crime was loving and trusting the wrong man.